one of the things that I heard, or that I realized once again today, is how in history in general, and I guess the Holocaust in particular for me, the story never ends, and we're always learning new things. And I learned something new today. I was sent a link to an interview done with Bella, the lady whose picture you'll again see here. But she was one of the girls who was in the camp along with Mary. She's the one who lives in New York, and she has not really made it a practice to go out and speak about the Holocaust at all. But she did grant an interview to a guy at the U.S. Holocaust Museum a number of years ago. And either she had forgotten about that or hadn't remembered it at the time that I met with her. But Mary's son just discovered it himself, and he sent it to me. So I listened to it in the car on the way up here. Oh. And I found a lot of very good detail about their life in the camps, particularly that Mary had not remembered. So I'll be able to add that to the book. But one fascinating detail I did learn about was when they were at their first camp, the Kaiserwald camp in Riga. That was an Arbeitslager, a work camp, and it was tough there, but it was not a death camp. And Bella mentioned that one day a bunch of women showed up from Auschwitz. Said they were Hungarian women, and she didn't know how they got there, why they were sprung from Auschwitz to come to the work camp, but they moved in, and they all had tattoos on their arms. And it was then, when talking with them, it was only then that she said we realized what was really going on with the Nazis and with the final solution and with the death camps. I mean, they did know about the mass shootings at Ponari outside of the city of Vilna, but they had no idea what was in other camps. And these women who, for some reason, came to Kaiserwald to work with them, told them of the mass executions in Auschwitz, and it finally hit home to the people who were at Kaiserwald what was happening with the Nazis. And that's a significant detail that is certainly going to go into the book. But they were, I think I did mention that a lot of the people in Vilna, even as the war was progressing, and even after some of the actions that they had, they still didn't get it, or they still didn't think that it was the Nazis' plan to kill them all. It was very slow to dawn on many people. And again, the young women who were sent up to Kaiserwald finally found out about it probably at the end of 1943. So, okay, so today...
I just want to add just one quick comment on that. It's interesting that there was a piece in the New York Times over the weekend, Sunday, on what's happening in Syria.
In Syria?
And there is camp and mass shooting and it seems like nobody's doing much about it.
Is that today? What's happening there today?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Almost not at the same scale, but a repeat of what happened then. Mm-hmm. And nobody's doing much about it.
Well, the guy who's still in charge of Syria is not a nice person, certainly.
No, sure.
And he's right up there with Mr. Hitler. And I suppose I shouldn't say this in this context, but I wish somebody would just get rid of him. He's just an awful person. He's just like his old man, probably even worse. And people had such high hopes for him because he went to England and got educated as a doctor. And he has a glamorous wife who got this big, super spread in, I believe it was Vogue, A Desert Flower, she was called. Oh. Anna Wintour, the very left-wing editor who's a big power in the publishing industry, put that thing together for him. It's scrubbed off all of the websites and things now when we've realized how what the Assads really are like. But Mr. Assad's wife, who's a nice-looking woman, got this spread like a model in one of those glamour magazines. There's really no justice, is there? Okay, so these are the topics I'd like to cover today. There will be a lot to get through, and unfortunately, I may end up speeding through it again. I have wanted to cover so much in the Holocaust. I hope I don't overdo it with the speed, but let's get to it anyway. I did mention This slide did come up last time. The How many people paid a price for what they did in the Holocaust? Not that many comparatively. Most of the big guys, except those who got away, did pay a price, but a lot of them got convicted, and many of the lower, middle and lower level people just were able to eventually melt back into society in Germany. 800 U.S. Prosecuted, the United States prosecuted 1,130 camp officials, 885 were convicted, 432 were sentenced to death, but ultimately of them only 261 ended up getting killed on the gallows. The largest mass execution in U.S. history was when 48 Germans from Mauthausen were hanged at Dachau. And a lot of people did get away thanks to, I'm sorry to say, the rat lines through the International Red Cross and the Vatican Relief Commission. The Pontifical College in Rome, the Father Kunislav Draganovic, he was the guy who ran the rat lines for the Croats, and Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, and a bunch of the bad guys from Croatia were sprung by them. This guy, Otto Ohlendorf, I think I mentioned, he was interceded for by Pius XII to the High Commissioner for Germany, John McCloy. That may be a familiar name to you. John McCloy, who became a big Wall Street lawyer after the war. Pius XII pleaded to McCloy to give clemency to this guy. He was responsible for 90,000 deaths. And McCloy fortunately blew him off, but the Pope was in advocating for this guy. I don't know. Not a particularly proud history. Now, the Mary and her friends ended up, after their liberation, they ended up in a displaced persons camp in Charleroi, Belgium, before they ended up going their separate ways. A couple of them went to Israel, but there were 2 million displaced people in Germany just at the end of 1945, and there were so many camps, United Nations relief, and in many cases the conditions and the treatment that people were getting wasn't all that much better than the concentration camps. I'm sure it was a matter of resources as much as anything else. And I can't imagine there was any intent to be discriminatory against them. But Harry Truman ordered Eisenhower to get with the program and really improve things. And one of the things that they wanted to do, or that they had in mind, was they wanted to keep Jewish refugees away from German people. They just didn't want them to mix. They thought there would be some real problems. Whether that would have happened, whether it happened in a lot of cases, I don't know. I think I did mention the one case of Mr. Handler, who was rescued out of the the tailoring operation in Vilna because he stayed under the pile of clothes for 2 months. He and his mother went back to their house after the war was over, and they kicked out the people who had come and occupied it, and they ended up making out pretty well. But people, in general, people who came back to their native cities, those who were able to make it back, particularly into Poland, were not welcomed. They were discriminated against, and their property had been taken away, and there was very little recovery of any property. We the U.S., unfortunately, did keep enforcing our quota system for a while, even after the war. There were 15,000 Jews admitted to the United States between 45 and 47. The British White Paper was still in effect for a while in Mandate Palestine. A legal limit of 15,000 Jews were to go there, but between 45 and 51, close to 200,000 Jews entered there illegal anyway. And Mary's husband, Mort, who was working for the Haganah, I'll get a little bit more into Mort's history in a minute. The Haganah, the Jewish paramilitary organization, was particularly adept at smuggling Jewish refugees in at night over the beaches and through small craft. They were able to get them in that way. So there were In 1945, the number of displaced persons total living in Germany, Italy, and Austria was between 7 and 11 million. We don't know how many it was for sure. And then finally, we in America liberated or lightened up a little bit on the quota system in '48. The 200,000 displaced people were allowed to come into the country over the next couple of years. And then 1950, the number went up to 415,000, but they did have some restrictions. It was against the only applicants who'd been in resettlement camps at the end of 1945 were eligible for visas. So they did keep a tight rein on that. But one thing that good old Harry did was he took and signed the legislation, but it took away from the State Department. It took away the responsibility for that from the State Department and gave it to a U.S. Displaced Persons Commission to administer the program. As I think I mentioned, the State Department was full of people who were not particularly fond of Jews, and they would do their level best to frustrate them from getting visas or getting paperwork. The paperwork requirements were tremendous. You had to have something like 30 documents in order to get a visa, and they would delay and obstruct it any way they could, many of them unfortunately. Okay, so by the end of '52, about 400,000 people were admitted to the United States, and more than 70% of them were from the East Germany, the eastern part of Germany, and from the Soviet Union. So by the end of 1952, 900,000 total people came into the United States. 400,000 of them were DPs from Europe, and 70% of them were from Eastern Europe and the Jews and the Soviet Union. So 300,000 people. So America did step up to the plate, admittedly belatedly, but they did step up to the plate after the war and let some of these unfortunate victims in to America where they could build a new life. And as we know, many of them did that in spectacular fashion. As I mentioned, a few Jews were able to get their property back. This is the building in Kielce, Poland. I believe I mentioned that last time, didn't I? Where there were 42 Jews murdered and a dozen others injured when a local kid told his father that I was kidnapped by a Jew, and he hid me in the cellar. And they ginned up a blood libel about it. Well, there's no cellar in this building, but it didn't matter. The locals, the state militia and local police came and investigated and beat up on the Jews, and then the police, another group of police came later, and they beat them up further. There were a total of soldiers were ended up quelling it finally, but then a group of metal workers came in and rioted against the Jews, and the Polish cardinal of Poland said, well, there's too many Jews in the government anyway, so they deserved it. Cardinal Holland. He's another guy who, I don't know if I'd want to be with him wherever he is now, okay? Now, Maud and Mary, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about their life together, how they ended up getting together, and how they were able to build a beautiful life in America after, quite a bit of, negotiation as they started dating. It's really kind of fun to hear. But he did end up, actually, she said he ended up saving her and bringing her out of her shell after she got to Israel. And I did mention, I believe, that their marriage is rather unusual, and that she is a survivor and he is not. That didn't happen very often at all. And it took Mary a lot of time to come and speak out before she really got comfortable and got she took it on herself, her personal mission in order to speak out. She did know that she was kept here on earth to do something when she had that near-death experience in Kaiserwald when she tried to drown herself. But it was not then that she determined to go and speak out. It built over a long period of time, and she's still out today. Last week, she was talking at a high school in Tampa, Florida, Plant High School. She's still out there. I have a picture of that a little bit later on. Okay, I've shown you these pictures already. This is her and her family. This is Dora, who's deceased. This is Bella, and that's Mary right there. That's the gate of the ghetto. And this is her paperwork. Again, the thing I like to point out here is that that's the identification paper for Israel. It was good for 1 year, and she told a little fib that she was born in Warsaw, so she wouldn't end up being under the jurisdiction of the Russians if she told the truth and said about where she was born in Vilna. Okay, this is the Polta. You can't read it from there, probably. The Polta Munitions Works in Magdeburg is where they had their last job. One of the things on Bella's interview today was a little bit of detail about that. And her job was taking artillery shell casings. Bella's job was artillery shell casings. And she had to dip them in some kind of acidic solution in order to polish them. And of course they didn't give her any gloves or anything. The hands were rubbed raw. They were 3 shifts at this munitions work, and then they'd ended up scaling back to 2 after a little while. But they needed all sorts of slave labor there. And Mary did have a job there with this lady I'm going to go see in California, and I'm going to get more detail about it from her, I hope. One of Mary's jobs that lasted only a day was to go into actually the furnace area where they baked the shells. They had to go in and retrieve them, I guess. And the atmosphere in there was terrible. People would last no more than a day or two. She and one of her girlfriends, which I think was Edith, had that job one day, and they begged the guy who was in charge not to ask them to come back the next day, get somebody else. And for some reason he agreed to. I mean, if he didn't, and they had come back, they probably would have died from the conditions just the next day. So this was another time when the coin was flipped and it came up heads. They asked and they received in Magdeburg. Okay, and this here is Bella. If you are interested, I can give you the link to that interview to her. I have it on my phone here, if you'd like to write it down. It is. This is at the U.S. Holocaust Museum. It's https collections dot ushmm.org. So it's U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, I guess, .org. /search /catalog, and then the number of the actual tape, IRN 558033. Okay, that's a lot. It runs about an hour and a half, and it's you'll hear this lady talking probably about 20 years ago, and that was the this was the day that I met her down in New York. That's a nice little Italian restaurant in Long Island City, which is a really cool place, actually. Right over the bridge from Manhattan. All sorts of ethnic groups are there, so you can walk down the main street and come to any kind of a restaurant you want. Okay. I did mention that Mary had some interesting family. These are her 2 cousins, Bear Kovner and Abra. Bear is the guy who was whacked by his friends, people he thought were his friends. He was whacked on the head and had some permanent hearing damage. That was the final straw for him when he decided he would pick up and move to Israel and go study literature. He was the one who was closest to Mary. They were very close buddies in Vilna. He was the bookish one. In fact, he was so bookish, his mother used to discourage him from studying too much, so he would come over to Mary's place, stay up at night, read under the covers and so forth. He was a very smart guy. He and Abba were initially Zionists in the youth groups in Vilna. Bear, for some reason, broke with the Zionists. He became a communist. Communists in those days were welcoming of anybody. They were one of the few organizations that would let Jews in. So he must have felt welcome there. But he ended up going to Israel, and I think I mentioned he was ultimately the head of the Communist Party in Israel. And he wasn't particularly a big rabid Zionist, but he very much disliked the British, and he wanted to be a Zionist because he wanted the Brits out of the Palestine area. He did his best to get that to happen. Abba, it was a guy who put together the manifesto about we are not going to be led as sheep to the slaughter, and they got some arms. I mentioned that they had blown up a bridge with some of the munitions that they had received covertly in the ghetto, and nobody knew about it, and they escaped just in time and became partisans in the forest. He wanted to wreak revenge for the killings. Did I tell you about his revenge plot last time? I'm not sure that I did. I
The
did?
Bakery.
Did he?
The bakery.
The bakery, I did. Okay. But he did burn with revenge, and he finally cooled off after a lot of years, and he became another one of the ventures that he was involved with was the Bereha movement, in which he did a lot of organizing of Jews who were refugees, getting them ultimately to Palestine, and that movement had pretty good success in getting people onto ships from Italy for some reason. They were able to get them down to Italy, and he ended up he settled in Palestine. He was there's a street named after him in Vilna. I drove down it the last time, or in Tel Aviv. I drove down it the last time I was there, and he joined the Givati Brigade in the war. So he had quite an illustrious career. Okay, this house was not the most sensitive. Okay, and that's Bear citing the Declaration of Independence. One other thing about Bear that I'm not sure he mentioned is he was able, because of his connections, to spring Mary out of the Atlit refugee camp within a few days after she got there. But she did. She got there at one time, and after they got off the boat in Haifa, and it felt like a concentration camp. And there was one time very early on that a girl from a family who knew her, saw her across the barbed wire fence, threw a bag of food and goodies to her. She never got it because somebody pushed her out of the way, grabbed it, and left with it. So the girl had to come back and do it again. But Bear was able to get her out and enable her to start her life in Israel. Okay, now a little bit more about more. Come on. I wonder if this thing needs a battery. How about this? Okay, we'll do it that way. All right, this is the Mary and Mort on their wedding day. All right, this is that dating. This is them on their wedding day. They got married the night that the War of Liberation started. They were in Tel Aviv, and the lights went out in the hall. They had to douse them, and he had to go off to fight right after the ceremony. He was born in Bialystok, and I think it's fair to say that he was a bit of a willful youth when he was growing up. He was very good in certain school subjects. His father tried to get him into various schools, and he rebelled against it and so forth. But he ended up being a pretty good kid. But then, after he had graduated from school, he really wasn't going anywhere. He hung around for a couple of years, tutored kids in technical subjects, and then he decided he would get into a group that would ultimately bring him to Israel. It's a youth group. Do they have that? I didn't write down the name of the group, but it was an organization of youth that were targeted to go by the Zionists to go to Israel and build a new life there. So he ended up getting his act together academically, and he went to the Technion, which is the MIT of Israel, the Technical Institute. He wanted to be he wanted to get educated technically in Poland and Lithuania, but he was not allowed to study science. He got it was a case of pure discrimination. He said that the technical positions were numerous classes, numerous meaning numbers, N-U-M-E-R-U-S, And for guys like him, it was a numerus nullus, which means no places for you. And he even made formal protest when a girl who was clearly not as good a student as he was admitted, and they just told him there was no place for him. So he did end up going to British Mandate Palestine in 1938, and was able to study there and build his career and his life there. On the way over, he almost got busted out. He was quite a ladies' man, actually. On the way over, he almost got busted out because he and a girl that he had made friends with on the ship snuck off together the final night, and were caught by the steward. And that was an offense that could have gotten him sent back, but it was the last night, so the steward let it go, and he was able to disembark and begin his life in Palestine. He had wanted to be a Farbemeister in Germany, or in Poland rather. Most of the Farbemeisters were German. Farbe is the word for color. One of the things that was really coming into vogue at that time in the textile industry was coloring, and you had to be educated, particularly in chemistry, to be a Farbemeister. And his father was in the textile business. He was an executive of a company that made clothing, I guess, or sold it. I believe they made it. And that is another interesting story. They were Bialystok was part of the Russian sphere of influence after the war started, after Molotov-Ribbentrop. So the Russians came in, and the first thing they did was send all the business executives. They nationalized a bunch of businesses, send all the leaders to Siberia. The guy who owned the plant, Mort's father's boss, beat it out of town. So Mort's father happened to be in charge of the factory. So the Russians come in, they said, "Who's in charge here?" And all the workers said, he is. So he ended up getting deported to Siberia as an enemy of the state. A couple of weeks later came a knock at the door, and his wife and their I believe there were 2 children left at home at the time. They were deported to Kazakhstan as families of an enemy of the state. But they all lived. In Kazakhstan, they lived in what was like a collective farm, and they did fairly well, and they stayed with a local family who was pretty nice to them. And then later on, when the war was progressing, and all of a sudden Stalin realized he could use some Polish allies, or he didn't want to be too nasty to Polish people, he gave sort of an amnesty to people who had been captivated from Poland. So the father was able to make it to Kazakhstan, and they all ended up making it to Israel. So they were in the Gulag, but at least they made it out after some years. Okay, so Mort came to Israel. He on the ship, actually, before he even disembarked, he was recruited by members of the Haganah. They trained him in firearms, and he was already a member of it before he even got off the boat. And he became a guard patrolling local areas, local neighborhoods, basically to keep the Arab population in line, to keep them away from the Brits. They were an illegal organization, the Haganah, and they on one hand they hated the Brits, on the other hand they worked with the Brits to keep the Arab population in line. Britain, as I think I mentioned, was very interested in that area for one reason. It was the local oil. At the port of Haifa, in 1940, 10 million barrels of oil came through Haifa to tankers that would end up serving the British Navy. And that British Navy ran on oil. Almost all Britain had was a navy. But one of the things that Mort had seen, another one of his jobs was as a railway policeman, and he decided he would go down to Cairo. He wanted to see Cairo. He ended up going down there right at the time the Al Alamein battle was heating up. I think I might have mentioned this last time. But what I didn't realize the full implications of what could have happened. And he had mentioned that if the Germans had won, he and his buddies were going to hightail it out and get back to Russia. But Germany sent 4 divisions down to Africa. As Rommel had just 4 divisions of guys. They had 130 divisions at the same time invading Russia. Had they done 2 or 3 more divisions of guys, they would have beaten the Brits. It was a very near thing. And had the Nazis then come up from Cairo up to Israel, had they been able to, they would have easily taken over Palestine because they had friendly Arabs there. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was a big buddy of Hitler's. He had met with him a few times. So all of the local population, other than the very small Jewish minority, would have been pro-German. They would have been able to choke off that oil from the British Navy. Remember, this is before the United States was in the war. They may very well have won the war had they thought a little bit more strategically. That's an interesting sideline. Okay. But then Mort ended up, let's see, after the war, he ended up serving in the War of Liberation. But one of his jobs was actually as a security guy, a security guard at an oil plant, and he was able to complete his studies because it was mostly a desk job. But another job he had was patrolling the beaches at night for submarines. That was another thing that they did. And they would, 4 guys would walk up and down the beach a couple of miles at a time, so 2 would sleep, 2 would do the work. And it was particularly boring and tiring, but somehow he was able to get through his studies. One night during his patrol of an area in Haifa, up near Mount Carmel, the upper regions of Mount Carmel consisted of Arabs and some wealthy Jews who had made it there earlier, well before the war. And he was walking along one night and he saw a cute girl and waved to her. And he thought she was Arab, but it turned out she was Jewish. So he asked her for a date. And she said, "No, I can't date you. I'm Sephardic and you're Ashkenazi. And I'm not allowed to date Ashkenazis." So he was a ladies' man, but that was one time it didn't work out for him. Okay. Now, Mary came along, and she, in Israel, she was put into a camp. She initially got a job working in a pajama factory. She had no training, no skills, so she was working in a pajama factory. And it was at that time that she began remembering things. And there was another lady who was related to her with whom she lived for a while. She was finally able to spill some of her memories, like the horrible memory of Stutthof and being the 151st in line for the gas chamber and just getting shot out. That came back to her at that time. That was she had some difficulty dealing with getting back into normal society, but she and a couple of her girlfriends went to a party one time, and they met Mort and his buddies. And Mort and his buddies thought they were big stuff. They were like the MIT graduates of the time. And if you were a Technion graduate, you were maybe like an Ivy Leaguer now. They were the upper crust of society. And they did catch each other's eye. He was intrigued by her and asked her out. And first thing she said no, and they ended up dating after a while. But what he did for her was that he took her. He says, "You've got to get out of that crappy job." So he took her to the Standards Institute of Israel, where he then worked. And they needed a telephone operator, so he said, "You're going to be a telephone operator." And she didn't speak Hebrew. But he said, "That's okay, I'll get my friend to sit with you." And within a year, she was speaking the Hebrew language fluently. I guess she did have a knack for it, but he saw something in her, and more or less forced her he dragged her out of herself and really made her confident. And that, they did end up getting married, but she just said, she told me in so many words, he did save me by doing what he did. He was told not to marry her. She's a survivor, she's damaged goods, and he decided to ignore that advice. And it was very, nice for us and for the world that he did. They have, this is him, and this is with one of his employers. He's receiving an award of some sort. He ended up coming to America. His company, the Standards Institute of Israel, had some kind of a deal with American industry. He actually came over a couple of times, and he had a high security clearance. His specialty was power sources, and I still don't know what he worked on, unfortunately. It was classified, but it was probably something to do with power sources for nuclear plants. And we were doing nukes at that time. Nukes did win the war, and nuclear energy was a very secretive endeavor of America. And Mort had that clearance, so he was able to come back and forth. He went to America a couple of times. And meanwhile, as I think I mentioned, Mary's hanging out with her cousin. Her best buddy was a leader of the Israeli Communist Party, so they had to meet secretly. That was, Mort's fears, I think, were pretty well founded, because he may very well have lost his job and his clearance if the government got wind of that. Okay. So that was Mort's career. He ended up later on. He came to America and ended up getting into the aerospace industry in Florida. He had a number of jobs that where his fortunes waxed and waned with the budgeting that America would put into the space program. But he ended up in Florida, and his final job was as the director of quality control for the Pfizer company. So that was a nice job. They were able to do some traveling, and it was in their travels that this incident here, that's Mary outside of Mauthausen. They were walking along in Vienna one day, and they heard some people discussing the Holocaust rather loudly on the street corner, and one of those discussing it loudly was a denier, and Mary just couldn't take it and pushed her way into the conversation and said, "Don't deny that, I was there." And somehow a TV cameraman got wind of it, and he asked her if she would be interviewed on camera. And she agreed to, but she wanted to do it outside the Mauthausen camp. So that's where she's being interviewed right there. This is Mauthausen in Austria. That was a camp that was nearby a quarry, and that were the work that they put the inmates to there, carrying stones, was just was very, very onerous, as you might guess. And Mauthausen was a notorious place, and that was still. It's still intact today. It's one of the places that Nazis were not able to get rid of before the Allies come along and saw what had been happening. So Mary they ended up settling in Florida. I think I showed you the Tel Aviv sunset last time. Mort wanted to settle in St. Petersburg because the sunset on the Gulf reminded him of Tel Aviv. So that's where they ended up settling. That's where they lived their life. They had a son born in Israel, and the daughter was born in America. She was born in Syracuse. That's where they settled initially. They didn't get a house up there. They lived with relatives for the better part of a year. The shares, the ones who had sent them the $200, Sam Scher, her uncle, had sent her $200 when she was in the DP camp, and she ended up spending it all on handbags, I think I might have mentioned. The years passed. They moved to St. Petersburg, and then one day her daughter Charlene came home, and she said, "Mom, we were talking about the Holocaust today in school," and I put my hand up and I said, "You were in it. Would you mind coming in and talking about it?" And Mary said, I don't know what I'm going to talk about. What should I say?" And that's where it actually started. And Charlene said actually that her teacher, I guess was the history teacher, was a little skeptical, and he wanted to meet this woman. He didn't know for sure if it was going to be for real or not. But that was the beginning of her speaking out to a junior high class where her daughter was. And actually her son told me that at that time he said, "Ma, why didn't you ever tell me about this? Why didn't you tell us about it at all?" And she had never thought about talking about her experiences. She had just moved on. A few years after that, a rabbi from the temple asked her to accompany him to a military hospital and asked her to speak to the veterans. This was a sort of a breakthrough time for her. And Mary again did not want to go, but the rabbi had told her that, look, these guys really need to see you. They need to hear from you. They need to know that their efforts were not in vain. That was the essence of his message. So she agreed to come. And it was after that she got at ease with speaking to groups and realized that she should do it. So it was a long process. She didn't get to it right away. I don't think she ever really intended to, but she is still out there doing it nowadays. And actually, Charlene sent me a list of places that she has spoken. Let's see if I can find it here. It was the Bay Pines Veterans Hospital in St. Petersburg. Okay, and she did. She spoke in Austria. That's in 1988 at Mauthausen. She was interviewed by the Steven Spielberg's Shoah Foundation in 1996. There's a link to her interview, I believe, on the list that I gave you. She spoke also at the dedication of this boxcar exhibit. Which was, this boxcar was brought to the St. Petersburg Museum in, when was that? The date of it? It was not at the founding of the museum, it was a few years after it. Yeah, she wrote a poem addressing the boxcar, which is pretty gripping. I do not have the text of it here. But they were, the boxcar was bought from the Polish National Railway by a philanthropist who supported the museum, and it's obviously of the vintage of the many thousands of cars that were used on the Polish and German national railways to transport people. Whether they weren't very sure whether this car actually was one of the ones used, and then they were cleaning it all up before putting it on display, and they found a little child's ring wedged in a crack on the floor. It belonged to a young girl. It had once held a stone, and the stone was no longer there. But they were able to analyze it and verify that it had been manufactured sometime in the 1930s, and a child from the era of the Holocaust would have had it. So, and that ring is actually in a little display right here. Right in front of the boxcar. It just tears your heart out to just imagine the little girl either dropping it or maybe sticking it in the crack, so somebody would find it. We don't know what happened to her, other than that she didn't survive the war. Okay. This is Mary speaking at the Florida Holocaust Museum. That's a lovely display behind her called the Kaddish in Wood. The guy over here there on the right is John Loftus, the fellow I said who was my Boston College classmate. He and I both attended that speaking session. She's talking to some high school kids there. That's her son Avi on the left end. He looks exactly like his father, his son and his wife, along with Mary. The Kaddish in Wood is all of these pictures are carved from a single block of wood by a man who lives up near Albany somewhere. He's a medical doctor by profession, but he's a wood carver by avocation. And he got hold of all these individual portraits. You can see this boy here, for instance, that's him. This girl, that's her. Maybe this is her, but let's see. Anyway, the portraits match the pictures of these children. They were all Jewish children from France. They were photographed apparently before they were all sent to their deaths at Auschwitz. And the Kaddish in Wood, the Kaddish is the Jewish prayer for the dead. you probably know. And that display spans the whole wall of the conference room in the Florida Holocaust Museum. And I mentioned that Mary had been speaking even last week. Here she is. These are all the kids at Plant High School in Tampa. She was signing a card there for that student. And they were, according to the email that I got from her son, the kids really bonded with her. And this is important, and this lady is still out doing it. More power to her. I think she deserves a book of her own, don't you? And finally, here she is with her son and daughter. I took that picture in their front yard. And this is the first time she had met Dave Eisenhower last year. And she was very happy to meet him because of what his grandfather, who really got it about what was going to happen with the Holocaust. As you probably have heard, when they were taken to the camp at Ohrdruf, which was one of the subcamps of Buchenwald, and they were introduced to some of the living prisoners who were still there, he immediately sent out a request/order to the United States Congress and then to the British Parliament, get some members of Parliament and Congress over here, get some journalists, get some photographers. We've got to record this now, okay? And a quote from that he had came up with at that time: "I visited every nook and cranny of the camp because I felt it my duty to be in a position from then on to testify at first hand about these things, in case there ever grew up at home the belief or assumption that the stories of Nazi brutality were simply propaganda." So this is, I had also heard that he said, we got to get the photographers in here so some son of a bitch will never say that this never, will sometimes say that this never happened. He probably also said that too. Okay. And then I took this picture. This was a very fun night. Mary was given clearance to fly back to Tel Aviv. Her health was good enough. She wanted to go back there one more time to tell her story to another generation of family members and friends firsthand. They still have an apartment in Tel Aviv. When they got married, they moved into it. At that time, it was right out on the outskirts of the city. Now it's probably almost in the heart of the city. And Tel Aviv is 10 times more crowded than the north end of Boston. You don't drive there. There are cars all over the place, and you don't drive there. You don't park there. But at the time the place was built, the first night that they slept there, they could hear the jackal howling out in the desert.
Oh, wow.
So that was pretty scary. And then I enjoyed this meeting immensely. I had no idea what was going on because they were all speaking Hebrew. So I drank my wine, I ate the challah, and I took pictures. Okay. How are we doing here? This is, we got a few minutes before the halfway point. I want to keep going and get a little bit into the rescuers and the righteous. They're reading and hearing about what people who extended themselves to save Jews during the Holocaust it's truly inspiring. If I have to say anything about them in general, it's how utterly ordinary most of them were. They were just regular people, in many cases unimpressive as far as their career had gone, with a few exceptions, of course, but they were just regular, ordinary folks. But what they were able to do, putting themselves on the line to either hide Jews or to supply them with food or whatever, it shows you, at least it shows me, what we as individuals can do, just in our own way, to combat and eradicate evil. They saw some of the most monstrous evil that man has ever perpetrated, and they were able to come through and save, in many cases, hundreds of thousands of Jews, in many cases, one or two of them. And I do have, I'll show you a book that I got. one of 10 volumes. This is one of 10 volumes of the Encyclopedia of the Righteous Among Nations. I really wanted to get this. I bought it from Yad Vashem. So I have 9 other books at home just like this. And each, they have cataloged by country. There are the biographies of people, biographical sketches of people whose good work was verified. Good work on the part of Jewish people was verified by witnesses. Jewish folks, one thing about Jewish people that I so admire, and I think it's their strength, it's probably kept them together for these many millennia, is that they remember. They remember who they are, where they came from. The Jewish religious rituals, why is this night different from so many other nights and so forth. They really do remember. When it came to remembering people who helped them out in the Holocaust, after a while, after they determined to do it, they really did do it right. They did. I don't know exactly how they organized their commission, but they had to have accounts by witnesses, people who were deemed to be among the righteous among nations. Could not be Jews. Jews are just supposed to do that. So if you're Jewish, you can't be a righteous. You must be a Gentile. The motivation had to be correct. So for instance, if you were hiding some people in order to convert them to your religious faith, then that didn't count. That was not an approved motivation, I guess. You had to be motivated properly. So they did a lot of homework. I think they're still adding people to the list. This particular book has only one of the 4 Americans that I'll talk about. At the time it was published, Varian Fry was the only guy who had been recognized as a righteous among the nations. But if you saw Schindler's List, you remember near the end, someone did quote the Talmud line, "He who saves a single life saves the entire world." I did remember that. Here's the real quote. It's and this is something that I like to read every now and then and ponder. This is from the Talmud, Sanhedrin 7:37a. "For this reason was man created alone, to teach thee that whosoever destroys a single soul of Israel, Scripture imputes guilt to him as though he had destroyed a complete world. And whosoever preserves a single soul of Israel, Scripture ascribes merit to him as though he had preserved a complete world." That's the full text of it. But the gist of it is, he who saves a single life saves the world entire. And that's pretty good shorthand. Okay. It's 1 o'clock. Shall we take a brief break? In the end of at the end of the war, and right before the beginning of the Israeli War of Liberation, the British and the Jewish folks were really at each other's throats. The Haganah was, as I mentioned, they were allied with Britain in one sense and keeping peace with the Arabs, but they were fighting against the British time and time again. And right near the end of it, he said that this is a passage that in the draft, the Mort chapter of the book, talks about the fighting between the British and the Jews, how it was nasty and cruel. The Jewish community committed to a homeland in Palestine attacked British police stations, shops, and other facilities that were involved in catching the illegal immigrants that were coming in. And the Etzel, which was one of their wings, carried out most of the reprisals. So the British hanged 4 members of Etzel in the Accra prison. So Etzel broke in and freed 47 of his people. Then after the British executed 3 more members, the Etzel went and captured and hanged 2 British sergeants. So it was really nasty between Britain and the Jews of the British Mandate. And that was, at least he maintains that it was one of the factors that finally caused the Brits to want to just up and leave. United Nations can take care of it. We're out of here. So they had the war was over. They probably didn't need the oil all that much, but it must have been like their Vietnam. It was a war without end. The resistance was going to keep up no matter what. So those were the times that people like Mort lived through, and we're very lucky here in America not to have experienced anything like that. Okay, coming back to the righteous among nations now. Unfortunately, I'll be able to get to just a few of them, a few of the people whose stories that particularly intrigue me. They are very inspirational indeed. And we'll start with this, another nice quote from the Talmud, which says, "The universe exists on the merit of the righteous among nations of the world, and they are privileged to see the divine providence." So, early on, in 1953, Yad Vashem was actually established. 1953, Ben Gurion, who was the prime minister, under Ben Gurion, they passed the Commission of Martyrs and Heroes Remembrance Law to commemorate and recognize high-minded Gentiles. That was a message to the Jewish people on Ben Gurion's part that, hey, we did have some help here, guys. But they didn't really do much with it, other than pass that law. They didn't push to find out who some of these people were. And it might have been, maybe he didn't push too hard, because you may recall that I mentioned the people who were Jewish refugees who ended up making it to British Mandate Palestine were discriminated against by the Jews who were already there. They looked down upon them and called them soaps. But it was the testimony of a guy named Herman Gravy, written testimony in the Adolf Eichmann trial, that was sort of the catalyst for the Yad Vashem to organize and really go out and find the righteous among nations. And you remember when Eichmann was captured and was at 61, brought back to Israel, tried and eventually hanged, that was the first time that people talked at a wide scale about what had happened in the Holocaust. I think the Jews who had survived it sort of wanted to forget about it. Either people in Germany certainly didn't want to talk about it, and people in other countries of Europe didn't want to talk about it, and Americans either weren't receptive to it or didn't want to talk about it either. But Graby was a German guy. He was a good guy, and he worked in building railroads in the Ukraine. And he is credited with saving about 300 Jews. The SS were always coming after him, trying to get his Jews to kill them, and he would not allow them to do it. And he testified against Eichmann to talk about what had been perpetrated, and then people did come forward and say, "Hey, I'm one of the ones who was saved by this Herman Gravy." So he was one who is recognized as the righteous, and they realized that there are a lot of guys out there, guys and women out there like him, that have to be sought out. And there was a rabbi named Harold Schulweis in California who was one of the prime movers in America to get the recognition of the righteous among nations going. Okay, so here's a chart we've seen before. This is the death count of the final solution. This has 5.7 million by country, and as you note, the very high percentages are in the eastern country, Poland, 90% and so forth, Lithuania, 84%. Now here are the righteous among nations. And you can see that Poland has quite a few, 6,700. The Netherlands, 5,500. Denmark has virtually nobody. The Danes resisted the idea of having individual people recognized. They were able to organize particularly the evacuation by boat across the Sound to Sweden when the Nazis were when they were tipped off about the Nazis going to be coming in and getting their Jews, the Denmark was allowed to operate for much of the war as long as they supplied the Germans with things like foodstuffs. They began resisting when the Germans wanted them to make munitions, and then the relationship deteriorated after that. But they were tipped off that a big Nazi raid was coming. They were tipped off by a German guy who was a shipping agent. And that was when they organized the boat lift and got many people out to safety.
There was a fellow named Foley, F-O-L-E-Y. In fact, there was a book written about him. I don't know if he was a British soldier, but he was Irish name, so I don't know if he may be Northern Ireland. And he supposedly saved about 4,000, also righteous among nations. I don't see anything that approximates Ireland or Great Britain having 4,000 saved.
Ireland, one guy, one person as a righteous among nations? Maybe that's him. I don't know. But this isn't necessarily incomplete. They're always adding to it.
Oh, that's the number of righteous.
Yes, these are the righteous, yeah. So I mean, Poland, we still hear a lot about Poland, unfortunately. The current government of Poland is pretty right-wing and nationalistic, and one of the things they're doing is distancing themselves from their history. Was Poland complicit in the Holocaust? Yes. Were Polish victims of the Holocaust, or were victims of the Nazis? Yes. They're both true. But depending on what side of the argument you're on, the Poles were either victims or not victims, and they don't want to hear about Jews. They don't want to hear about a place called Jedwabne, which was the town in which all of the local Jews were herded into a barn. The barn was burned down, and it was done by the locals. It was not done by the Nazis. And there's denial of that history, and it's very, very contentious even nowadays. But there were many people, and they had many more opportunities in Poland to step up and help fellow Jews, help Jews, not fellow Jews. France, that's surprising because I don't think there were all that many Jewish victims in France, but almost 4,000 French. Netherlands, 5,500. That's a very impressive number. But the Netherlands was also a place where there were an awful lot of collaborators, Nazi collaborators. So it was particularly dicey for people in the Netherlands to be among the righteous. But here they are here now, and America, United States has there are a total of 5 people, 5 Americans. Okay, there are a number of different motives that the righteous have been found to have had in their work. People they could be motivated by morality. They may revere the Jewish people as a people, even though they are not themselves Jewish. If they're members of a professional network, they have a tendency to get together and do things in concert with other people. By professionals, I mean people who are in the helping professions, social workers, medical people. They would tend to gravitate toward helping. And there are some who are just particularly interested in saving children. Okay, those who are motivated by morality, they can be. There are a couple of subsets of that. It could be based on your ideology of wanting to defeat Nazism. It can be emotional out of compassion, or it could be religious. And those who are motivated religiously, interestingly to me, but I can see how it works, can be motivated extrinsically or intrinsically, which means if you are motivated extrinsically, it's because you're a member of an organized religion, and we as a group are doing something. I'm on the team with this group of people, be it Protestants, Catholics, Quakers, whatever. And then there are the people who are intrinsically motivated in that they get and internalize the message of their religion and then act upon it. They're not necessarily acting as a member of a group. They're just getting their motivation. It's spiritual. It's spirituality versus religion, basically. But those who are intrinsically motivated tend to be a little bit more unselfish, and more of those who were religiously motivated internally ended up being rescuers. The religious nuns and priests in the Catholic Church, I've said a lot of critical stuff about the Catholic hierarchy, and I think it's fair, but many nuns and priests, pastors, were intrinsically motivated. They didn't particularly care what Pius and some of his bishops and cardinals were saying. They were going to do the right thing. I did mention Bishop von Galen of Munster speaking out against the euthanasia program in 1941. That was good, but it was half a loaf. He probably should have spoken out against the killing of the Jews as well. But he did take a moral stand, and that, to reiterate, had Pope and some of his other cardinals taken a similar moral stand early enough on, it may very well have turned out differently. And people in Germany, a very heavily Catholic and Christian country, they did defer to the moral authority of the Pope, as Catholics still do. And had they spoken out forcefully then, things might have been very different. But the religious communities did step up to the plate. One interesting one was in the town of Assisi in Italy. St. Francis of Assisi, the guy who loves the animals. There was a Francesco di Bernardone, was the leader of it. There was no Jewish community that had ever lived in Assisi, but the Bernardone and the Bishop of Assisi, Monsignor Giuseppe Placido Niccolini, ordered Father Aldo Brunacci, all these Italian guys, love them, to let's organize and do something for these Jewish people. So they had a total of 26 monasteries and convents where they allowed the Jews to come and stay. They could stay there for as long as they wanted. They had a transit network to get them further out of danger. They even did stuff like for the Jewish holidays. They brought in Jewish religious icons and things like menorahs and whatever else the Jewish folks needed to take part in their own celebrations within the convents and the rectories themselves. And they were really heroes that way. And these were, again, were the Catholics supportive? How many Catholics are among the rescuers? I'm sure there are thousands. Was the Catholic hierarchy? Not so much. So it's both answers are true. Were they supportive? No. Did they like the Nazis? That is true too. Some of them did. Okay. The people who are in networks. We'll talk about Miep Gies a little bit. She was the woman who ran the business for Otto Frank in Amsterdam. When he had to go into hiding, she ran the place for him. But her husband had been working with the Dutch resistance for 6 months before he even told her about it. That's how secretive you had to be. And in the Denmark underground, there were a total of 20,000 resistors of all sorts of different political beliefs. But they would perform little acts of mutiny and sabotage against the Germans. But they were all in it together. The guy who was the German shipping agent, by the way, was George Duckworth. I mentioned professional, the medical workers, who would naturally gravitate toward helping people. One particular story was that there were a group of doctors, I think it was in the Netherlands, I didn't write down the country here, who decided they would try to use their surgical skills to work on circumcised boys and reattach foreskins. And they worked on 250 kids, and about 100 of them survived, because it's easy to tell a Jewish boy, isn't it? Just tell him to drop his pants, and if he's circumcised, you take him away to the camps. So these doctors, and by using their particular skill, were able to save a bunch of Jewish boys that way. Okay, here are the Americans, who are the righteous among nations. These are the 5 people. These are the Sharps, Lois Gundon, Arian Fry, and Roddy Edmonds. Lois Gundon, I don't have a lot of detail about her, but she was from Goshen, Indiana, and she was teaching in southern France for the Mennonite Central Committee. And she was able to hide people, not only Jewish people, but also Spanish refugees from the Civil War there, and get them through a network and get spirited out of the country. The Germans caught her in '43, but she was not killed. She was swapped out in a prisoner exchange in 1944. But this is little Lois Gundon. Now the Sharps, Reverend Dickie Sharp, Martha Ingham, and Waitstill Sharp. Martha Ingham, Dickie Sharp, and Waitstill. They were Unitarians. She was a social worker. He was a pastor. They first worked with the Quakers to advance refugees' visa applications to Paraguay and so forth. There was they went to Paris from France. They were working in France, and Martha Shaw, personally escorted 35 refugee children to Great Britain. That was her own little version of the Kinder transport. They ended up going to Lisbon in 1940, and they helped a lot of Jewish intellectuals escape Vichy France, including a novelist named Leon Feuchtwanger, which I guess he was a pretty well-known guy at that time. I hadn't heard of him. And then she ended up personally escorting 27 adults and 10 children to America. She also founded Children to Palestine in 1943 to help get kids whose parents had been taken from them over to Palestine. So that was working through official and semi-official channels. The Sharps were able to save many Jews. Varian Fry is a really interesting character, and I just ordered this book that was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal. Where is it here? There's a book that's actually, it's a fictionalized account of his life, and I did not read it before coming here, unfortunately. Where is it? I thought I had printed it out here. Damn it, I guess I didn't. But he was a journalist who was in Europe. He was educated at Harvard. He reported and wrote about Nazi atrocities in the 1930s, and when war broke out, he ended up going down to Marseille, and he and some of his friends saved between 2,000 and 4,000 refugees, largely through working against the orders of their government, the State Department, and against the wishes of Vichy France, who were Nazi puppets, getting people phony visas and things like that. They hid people in a place called Villa Bel Air until they could be smuggled out of Vichy France. About 2,000 people they were able to get across the border to Spain. For some reason, he actually, when he came there down to Marseille originally, he had a list of Jewish intellectuals that they wanted to get out. Hannah Arendt was one of them. Marc Chagall was another one. There were a few other very prominent people. And these people actually were the kind that were seen as especially undesirable by the State Department. You know, government people don't like creative people. That's a generalization, but they were, you know, people like that are just, we don't want them around anyway, whether they're Jews or not. So that was a little bit difficult on Varian Fry. He was also working with another guy, one of the few people in the American State Department who went against his superior's orders, a man named Hiram Bigham, who is not among the righteous, but he probably should be. He took matters into his own hands and helped people get phony visas. One of the things that Fry did was set up an office of a committee he had that was as a front, and there was another office working to manufacture phony documents, to bribe people, who were in Vichy, France, to get more documents for for safe passage. And it was he was just a very ordinary guy, a very flawed individual. And here, this is a quote from a letter to his wife in 1941. He said, "Among the people who've come into my office, or with whom I'm in constant correspondence, are not only some of the greatest living authors, painters, and sculptors of Europe, but former cabinet ministers and prime ministers of half a dozen countries. And what a strange place it is here in Europe when men like this are reduced to waiting patiently in the anteroom of a young American of no importance whatsoever." This is what he thought of himself, but the work that he was doing certainly was of importance. Again, underlining the point, I think, that the utter ordinariness of people who were working to save the Jews. Okay, Master Sergeant Roddy Edmonds. He was from the Midwest somewhere. I believe he was from Kansas. He was in a German prisoner of war camp. His unit was captured, Stalag 9A, the POW camp in Germany, and he was the senior non-commissioned officer, so he was in charge of 1,200 guys. He was the head of the delegation, if you will, head of the group of prisoners. He was the guy with whom the commandant would deal. So the camp commandant came to him one morning and he said, "Assemble all your Jews out in the yard tomorrow morning." And the next morning, all 1,200 soldiers came out there. And the commandant was furious and demanded that he separate out the Jews. There were 200 to 250 of his guys were Jewish. And Edmonds told him, "We're all Jews here." So the man put his gun to his Luger pistol to the forehead and demanded him that he comply with the order. And he did say, "Look, the war is going to be over pretty soon. If you pull that trigger, you're going to be prosecuted as a war criminal." And the German guy knew he was telling the truth, so he backed down. Edmonds never told anybody about this. He did have it in his diaries, and after he died, his son found it. His son found the material and said that this really deserves some recognition. He brought it to the attention of the people at Yad Vashem, and they were able to corroborate the story. But this an ordinary guy who he didn't think of himself as a hero, didn't bother telling anybody. How many people do you know who are in any of the wars that America has fought that just don't talk about it? For whatever reason. This guy, he probably should have talked about it, or he's told a few people about it, but he didn't. He was just too modest to do it. So you gotta love folks like that, don't you? Okay, so much for the Americans. I like all sorts of Americans. Okay. Okay. Everybody knows Oskar Schindler. This is Oskar Schindler. Here he is in the movies, riding his horse with his mistress. And the scene in the movie, which is right after that, you recall that the only item of color in the movie was the red coat. That actually did happen. And that was something that really spurred him to turn around and do what he could. He was you talk about flawed individuals. He was a womanizer, he was a carouser, liked to drink and party, and he was there, at least initially, to get what he could from the businesses that had been damaged or taken over or whatever when he moved into that part of Poland. He was a guy who was on the make, so he was in some things for himself, but he did finally see the light and draw up his list. He saved about 1,200 Jews. Now, he came to Israel in 1961 and was hailed as a hero. By the way, after the war, the Jewish folks, the Jewish relief commissions, or some groups of Jews who had some money to invest wanted to help him out. They set him up in a business. It failed utterly. He was not able to make a go of it. He came to Israel in 61, was hailed as a hero, and he went back to Frankfurt and was pelted with stones. They didn't particularly like what he did, and he was convicted of assault back in Frankfurt when he he sucker punched a guy who called him a Jew kisser. So he didn't have a very happy life at all. He died in October of '74 from complications of alcoholism. He did drink too much. Again, a very flawed individual, but a very heroic one. This is Anna Borkowska. That is Mother Bertranda, who was in charge of the convent outside of Vilna that hid Abba Kovner. This is Abba Kovner, Mary's cousin, at the introduction of Anna as a member of the righteous. She was finally caught by the Nazis after they had harbored the Jews for a while. And you remember she and her nun buddies were able to smuggle grenades into the ghetto and give Abba something to work with in terms of munitions. She was caught, sent to a labor camp. They didn't kill her, and she ended up being freed. And she decided she would leave religious life after the war and went to work at some menial job in Poland. And then Abba did get her to be recognized as a member of the righteous. And that was 17 members of the group were initially secreted in her convent outside Vilna. Okay, what else did she do? She was in living in a small apartment in Warsaw. That's where they were able to track her down, and it didn't happen until 1984. So she lived in obscurity, with her memories, but certainly with her blessings from the Lord for what she had done, and she was finally appropriately recognized. The next group of people are all, they all had some diplomatic abilities, diplomatic powers. This is Raoul Wallenberg, who was educated in America at the University of Michigan, and he was sent over to Hungary by Sweden. And this is Richard Chamberlain, who played him in Wallenberg, A Hero's Story, which was a TV movie, made-for-TV movie. It had to be at least 20 years ago now. Richard Chamberlain of Dr. Kildare fame. The pass up there is for the chief rabbi of Budapest. That was a phony pass that they were able to put together. Hungary was a sort of a late in the war. The Germans got very energetic about deporting as many Jews from Hungary as they possibly could. Wallenberg was working on behalf of the government of Sweden, which was officially neutral during much of the war. In fact, a lot of their raw materials ended up coming to the right, coal and iron and so forth. But the Swedes came over to realize they should not be on that side, and one of the things they did was send Wallenberg to Budapest to see what he could do. And they ended up by putting up, they had a total of 30 safe houses that were where all the people were under the protection of the Swedish government. They didn't allow Eichmann and his buddies in there. Let's see, there were about 100,000 of the Jews of Hungary, particularly in Budapest, were saved due to the efforts of Raoul Wallenberg, who was also in league with Cardinal Roncalli, who became Pope John the 23rd, the Catholic cardinal. He was one of the good guys, and there were a couple of other actors here that I'll get to in a minute, whose stories are also fascinating. But Shione Sugihara was a Japanese diplomat who worked in Kaunas, Lithuania. He was sent there by his government when things were beginning to heat up. It was before the war, but he was sent there to basically keep an eye on what was going on in Eastern Europe. And so things got worse and worse after 1939, and the people in Lithuania were desperate to get out before it was too late. There was one day where Jews kind of came to him and pretty much begged him to get them some kind of paperwork to help out, and he ended up disobeying direct orders of his government and handwriting out 6,000 visas for Jews to travel across Russia under the protection of the Japanese government. The scheme, the line was that they were going to go and study religion in the Dutch colony of Suriname. He was in league with the Dutch consul up there. So that was the line that they came with. But at least they got out of Lithuania. 6,000 of them many of them ended up going across on the Trans-Siberian Railway. Some went by ships, but they ended up in Shanghai. And Shanghai at that time was a city that was an open city. It was, of course, the war was going on, but there were enclaves where people could stay, and there was a Jewish community there, a Jewish ghetto. And many of them survived the war and ended up coming to America. They're called the Sugihara survivors. Sugihara was working in direct contravention of orders from his superiors. He ended up getting busted, lost his job, and lived in poverty for many years. He's finally now recognized as a hero, as he should be, but he paid a career price to do that. So that's courage of a different sort, putting his livelihood on the line. He wasn't in any danger of getting killed, most likely, but he could have been very comfortable in his job and said no, and he didn't. He did the right thing. So, him. These two guys, Aristides de Souza Mendes and Giorgio Perlasca. Mendes is he was from Portugal. He was stationed in Bordeaux, and he again used his position to give transit visas to people fleeing through Bordeaux. The dictator of Portugal at that time was Antonio de Salazar. He expressly forbid it. Mendes went ahead and did it anyway. And in the space of 3 days, he signed entry visas for 30,000 refugees from Vichy, France, to come into Portugal. He got back to Lisbon. He was fired. He was stripped of his position, and he died penniless in 1954. He was never recognized during his lifetime. It wasn't until the 70s when de Souza Mendes finally fell from power, and he's now ancient bad history as far as the Portuguese are concerned, and one of their national heroes is Aristides de Souza Mendes, as it very well should be. Now, Giorgio Perlasca, again, I don't want to say a flawed individual. He certainly was unusual, and he was I guess the best way to describe him is that he was a con man. His first job was with the Italian army. He went with them to Eastern Europe, and his job was to procure material goods, food and whatever else he could, clothing maybe, from the locals. He was sort of a procurement officer. So the war was going on, and all of a sudden Italy switches sides. So what's this guy going to do? He decided he would stay there, and he worked with a Angel Sanz Brits, who was a charge d'affaires from Spain. And he was, Sanz Brits was also a good guy who would help out with phony paperwork and hide Jews under his own jurisdiction in Budapest. He was in Hungary. But then he gets recalled. His government wanted him to go to Switzerland, so the office was going to close. And so he said to Perlasca, okay, well, I have to leave, why don't you come with me? And Perlasca says he decided he would not. He stayed there. He told the Germans that it wasn't Giorgio, my name is Jorge, and I'm Spanish, and I'm the new guy in charge here, and the office is staying open. And he was able to con them into believing him. He was so he kept writing phony paperwork for people. There was a law that had been passed many years ago granting Jews who were thrown out of Spain by Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492. The Sephardic Jews, if you could prove that you were descended from them, you could automatically be a Spanish citizen. So he said all the Jews here are Spanish citizens because of that, and he was able to save a bunch of them that way. There was one point where he actually went to a train where people were being boarded. There were two boys he was interested in, and he faced down Adolf Eichmann and demanded that the two guys the two young boys be released from the train, and he succeeded. So he ended up saving more than 5,000 Jews. That's quite a bit more than Oskar Schindler. His story would really make a good movie, I think. He also prevented a plan to blow up the Jewish ghetto. It had 60,000 people in it. He was able to get wind of that and beat it down somehow. After the war, he returned to Italy. He didn't. He was living in poverty. He wasn't able to get himself a good job. And finally, in 1987, a bunch of Hungarian Jews came looking for him. They remembered him, and they wanted to help honor him. They searched him. They searched for him for many years in Spain, but they didn't find him. And they ended up finding him in Italy, and he was finally recognized. So here, another very flawed individual doing just tremendous work. And finally, he's being recognized for what he is. There's Bishop Angelo Roncalli, I've already mentioned. He was to my mind, he's the best pope we've ever had, at least in my lifetime. It's just unfortunate that he was so old. I mean, he took the papacy. He didn't last that long, but he was a really good guy, and what he did a lot to undo what Pius had done. He didn't buy Pius's act because he reported to him. There was one time where he met with Rabbi Isaac Herzog in 1944, who was the chief rabbi, who asked for him to intercede for the 55,000 Jews who were interned in Romania. As the papal delegate to the Ottoman Empire, he had quite a bit of diplomatic authority, and he could he could speak to the heads of government, and he did a lot to persuade King Boris of Romania that the Germans are going to lose, you better be on this side, and Romania ended up distancing itself from Hitler. There was another point where there was Operation Baptism, where he got wind of what some of the nuns were doing, giving phony baptismal certificates. He said, that's a great idea, we have Operation Baptism. He ordered his priests and Monsignors to get with that program. And there was a point where he was asked to, in January 1943, here's another illustration. He was requested by one of the diplomats over there to ask the Vatican if they would intercede in using their influence in other neutral countries to help Jewish refugees. He had asked the German government had told the Palestine Jewish Agency that 5,000 immigration certificates were actually available, and he asked Vatican Radio to broadcast that and to broadcast the fact that if you help out the Jews, it's a good thing, and Vatican Radio refused to do that. They didn't even make that broadcast. So he didn't particularly care for the Pope and the guys who were in the Curia, and you can see why. So he was one of the good guys. And Sir Nicholas Winton is the guy who he had a good long life. He organized the Kinder Transport, he was on a vacation in Czechoslovakia. He was skiing there, I think, and saw what was going on. 669 children. They were mostly Jewish. They were brought right before the outbreak of World War II on the Kinder Transport. They were brought to England. So he too was one of the good guys. So all these people, they're just great. This is another one of my favorite stories. This lady died almost 10 years ago to today. Irena Sendler. She was a Catholic girl in Poland. She was a social worker. She also had nursing background, and she was the head of the Zygota, which is the Council to Aid Jewish Children in Warsaw. So these were Christians, these were Catholics who wanted to do something to aid Jewish children. She had a past. She was qualified as a sanitary worker. So she had a past to go in and out of the Warsaw ghetto every day. That's her in her truck. She had a big fierce dog that she trained to bark whenever the Nazis came nearby her. She would smuggle Jewish children out every day. The bigger ones she would put in the back and cover them with blankets and tools and toolboxes. The infants she would actually put in her toolbox. And she saved approximately 2,500 kids. The Yad Vashem book about her isn't clear about the number of kids that she saved, but she personally had a hand in at least 2,500 kids. She recorded their names and hid them in milk cans and buried them somewhere with the hope that they would be reunited with their parents. And of course, almost none of them were, because the parents were all killed from the Warsaw Ghetto. The Nazis eventually found out what she was doing. They broke both her arms and broke both her legs, but she was allowed to live, and she had a good long life. She was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007, which was shortly before her death. She did not get it because they found a much better candidate for it that year. Anybody care to guess? Al Gore.
Oh.
Okay, but Irena Sendler is one of the true heroes. About 2,500 people, children personally, she saved. This is Miep Gies, who was the one who worked at Otto Frank's business. This is Otto Frank here. He is the only one of the Frank family who survived. He went to Auschwitz, but it was near the end of the war, and he was able to get out. It was 25 months in Amsterdam, where they hid the Franks. They were told they were ratted out by somebody. She was actually born as in Vienna. Her real name was Hermione Santruschwitz, and she ended up being sent to Leiden, Holland, to live with a Dutch family. And she was almost going to be sent away herself, but the soldier who was interrogating her, or the SS guy, probably was a soldier, because an SS guy it probably wouldn't have worked, but the fact that she was from Vienna actually saved her from being sent away to the camps herself. Okay, she kept Frank's business open, and it was supposedly under Christian management while the Franks were in hiding. And let's see, what else did. And there was one occasion where she and her family spent the night in the annex, so they could realize and understand what it was that the Franks were going through. Okay. Corrie ten Boom is another very interesting lady from Haarlem, the Netherlands. She was the daughter of a watchmaker and a deeply religious family, the Reformed Calvinists. This was a group of people who revered the Jews as the chosen people, and they were very religiously motivated. She ended up being a qualified watchmaker herself, the first woman to do that. They lived in a place in Haarlem, which was they were watchmakers, clockmakers. It was a very busy business. It was a 2 or 3 story building, and it was a perfect hub for a network of refugees to come and go. They had some secret rooms there, and they were able to save. I don't know if I have the number there. I don't have the number of people that they saved, but they were the hub of the network in Haarlem, the Netherlands. They ended up coming to getting informed upon in 1944. Okay, there were 35 people in that network were arrested and sent to a concentration camp, including the entire family. She ended up in the Ravensbrück concentration camp, which was the women's camp near Berlin. She and her sister were there, and her sister, there was a very cruel woman who was, they called her the snake, I think, because she wore silvery stuff that looked like snakeskin. But the sister spent much of her nights praying devoutly for the snake and for their captors, wishing that God would bless them and make them see the light and so forth. So that's how religiously motivated she and her sister were. For some reason, for some glitch, Corrie was allowed to go. There was a paperwork screw up, and they let her go. And almost as soon as that happened, they realized that it was too late to get her. Everybody in her unit was put to death after that. They think through the activities of the ten Boom family, about 800 Jews were saved. And actually, after that raid, when the 35 were taken away, the building was vacant. There were 6 Jews hiding in a secret compartment. The Nazis searched the place and they didn't find him. They did, once they were taken into the network, they had people who were trained carpenters come in and put together the false room, design it just for Jews, and it worked. Here's a young man whose heroism is particularly extraordinary, and he'll be the last guy we'll talk about because I want to float a couple of questions to you before we end. He was working on a rabbit farm for a guy who was there were slave laborers in an Austrian-owned armaments factory. He worked for the factory owner who had a sideline raising rabbits. So this guy was in charge of the rabbit farm. A few Jewish girls were working for him. And he was very good to them. He kept them well fed in contravention of orders. They ended up going to Auschwitz for a while, but they were in very good shape and were able to survive. And they think it's because of this guy's efforts on their behalf. But there was one point where one of the girls got a very serious disease, an infectious disease. It was life-threatening. If she didn't have medicine, she was going to die. He couldn't take her to the doctor because that would expose her and she would have been sent away. So what he did was infect himself with the same disease. He went and got medicine, brought it back and shared it with her and saved her. What motivates people to do that? Okay, and he was denounced, and the SS ended up taking him, but he escaped and made it out. Okay. Here's a poet, Hannah Sanesh, was an inspirational person to me. I happen to like her and admire her very much. She's Jewish, so she's not a member of the righteous, but she was from Budapest, went to Israel, trained as a paratrooper, came back, was caught, and would not give up under threat of torture and death. She would not give up any information about her colleagues. She's looked upon as a national hero. In the last couple of minutes, I'd like to ask a question about telling the story today. And I start this section with a quote from a woman named Joyce Hackett, who wrote Disturbance of the Inner Ear, which is a fictional account. It's a very fine novel about the daughter of a survivor who is a violin prodigy. And it's quite well done. But this quote was by her when she was interviewed by a magazine after her publication. And she says she did meticulous research. She interviewed, actually the character's a cellist, not a violinist, and she interviewed 600 cellists to be sure that she could write authoritatively about what it's like to play a cello. But she said that the book turned out to be living about the task of living after trauma, no mastery of the past, and so forth. And among all of the prisoners or the survivors that she mentioned, she said that their greatest fear was that the truth of history would not be told and recorded. And this was 10 years ago now, but all over Europe, the battle for the story was still being waged. And I think that is very true today. The battle for the story is still being waged. We see the Polish nationalists, this is just from the other day, Polish nationalists are marching to the U.S. Embassy in Warsaw to protest Holocaust claims. The United States has passed a law requesting all of the countries of Europe to report on what you're doing for your Jewish victims. Poland has been the least compliant, and they're protesting against it. And we're not one of the protesters at this demonstration just a couple of days ago outside the U.S. Embassy in Warsaw said that they had a sign saying, "We will not apologize for Jedwabne," which was the community that was burned down, or the barn that was burned down by the locals, not by the Nazis, with Jews in it. We will not apologize for it. There's another story in the New York Times that headline of which, "An Auschwitz exhibition fails the Jews." This was just in the New York Times the other day. There was a traveling exhibition
of artifacts from Auschwitz. It's now in New York. And what this writer says, and what actually another writer in the Jerusalem Post kind of echoes, is that this display sort of almost pushes the Jews to aside, to be an afterthought. They're talked about as later on victims of the Nazis, and it says here that the Nazis' first enemies were Poles and were French and were communists and so forth, and later on the Nazis came to pick on the Jews. So the point that this writer is trying to make, and that a column that I read in the Jerusalem Post recently, was that the talk about the Holocaust nowadays in many quarters seems to make it part of a much larger package. It's education, Holocaust education, in many quarters at least, has become education about prejudice, about bullying, and so forth. And at least these writers seem to think that that's not a good thing. I want to skip over that. Yeah. I do want to ask this question. What should they teach, really? Is there any thought here? Does anybody have any opinions as to whether Holocaust education should be only about the Holocaust and the particular Jewish character of it, or should we lump it into things, into the history of places like Armenia and Rwanda and slavery in America? Does that dilute the story? And does anybody have any thoughts about that? I'd be interested in hearing if anybody thinks that we should, if we're going to be talking about the Holocaust, let's talk only about it, rather than making it a part of something else, of other bad things that have happened in human history. Because at least what some of these people, some of these columnists are saying, that it's just not the same. It was a unique event and uniquely Jewish, and it was anti-Semitism that did it. It wasn't just prejudice. It was anti-Semitism, and notwithstanding what this Auschwitz exhibition mentions, that the Jews were picked upon later on, that really isn't true. Hitler was writing Mein Kampf about the Jews back in the 1920s. Killing the Jews or getting rid of them or whatever it was were always central to the mission of the Nazis, right from the beginning. Maybe they didn't, in fact, I remember mentioning in the section about the camps that they didn't really move the Jews into the camps in great numbers until about the middle of the war. There was camp capacity there because all the Russian guys had died. But they always intended to do something bad to the Jews. And contemporary accounts might sort of elide that. And maybe trying to make the Jews and their victims, to equate them to other people who have been discriminated against and treated badly. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Any thoughts about that? I would be very much interested in if anybody has any thoughts about it.
Well, I think the Jewish Holocaust was uniquely different from others in the way that you said he was writing about Jewish people negatively since the 1920s. And so that can't be ignored. However, there have been other Holocausts, and, should we have a general studies for those others? But I think the German Holocaust, Jewish Holocaust, definitely needs to be kept up front.
Yeah, and
It should be out there.
I don't want to use the word cheapen necessarily, but by making the Jews and the Jewish victims all of a piece with, the Tutsis in Rwanda. They were the victims of the Hutus, or like the Armenians. In lumping them together, as badly as those folks were treated, does it somehow? I don't want to use the word cheapen, but make it, make the Jews seem a little bit, less the terrible victims than they were. I mean, a whole nation mobilized to kill an entire people. It was because of probably the oldest prejudice in the world, anti-Semitism, which I think we can agree is still there.
It's still
Oh,
there.
yeah.
So should Holocaust education only encompass the Holocaust? I happen to think that it should, and I think if you study it properly, you can learn an awful lot of universally applicable lessons about prejudice itself, and then about things like, about courage, about cowardice, about good and evil, about what's a good government, what's not a good government. There are a lot of lessons you can learn just by studying the Holocaust itself. Just in the same way that you can, if you study Hamlet, you're not going to learn about Denmark. You're going to learn about good and evil.
I don't think we know 20% of the Armenian disaster. The Turks did a job on that section of their country, and many, many thousands of Armenians were killed. But we have no idea of the details as we have of the details of the Jewish Holocaust.
Even
But to
when
me,
they talk
that's
about
what
World
the
War
Holocaust
I, they gloss over the Armenian.
And as Hitler once said, nobody remembers
Nobody
that.
remembers the Armenians.
Right.
And the German Holocaust, the Armenian Holocaust, and even the Irish Holocaust, which went on for an extended period of 800 years, were always religious based. The Tutsis and Hutus, it wasn't religion, it was clans or tribes. But, the Armenians, it was the Christian Armenians versus the Muslim Turks, the Jews versus every Christian in Europe, and the Catholic Irish versus the Protestant English. And, always seems to have a religious base of hate.
Okay, but it's a question that I struggle with myself. I'm coming down on one area, but I'm certainly open to suggestion. Well, I would like to close with a quote that really does get to me. It was it's at the end of a book that's on your list. I Was a Boy in Belsen, about Tommy Reichenthal, a man I met. Actually, I heard him speak at Stonehill College a couple of years ago, and it was all college kids, and you could have heard a pin drop. It was an inspirational evening. But he is now an Irish citizen. He was from Slovakia originally, and the Irish did. They have one show memorial in a town called Listowel, and their local poet star, Patty Fitzgibbon, spoke the following there. Go home from this place and tell your children and your grandchildren that you've looked into the eyes and have shaken hands with people who have survived the greatest cataclysm mankind has unleashed on mankind. Tell them to tell their children and their children's children, because these people will be mourned and spoken about and wept over for 10,000 years. For if they aren't, we're all done for. I think those are inspiring words, and I think they're right. And with that concludes our course. I thank you very much for being here. And safe home.
Thank you. You have a title?